Hi, everyone. I noticed on my way up that Jude Patton is on Zoom. So, hi, Jude. I love you. I'm talking today about Ari Kane, Ariadne Kane. Um, Ari has been tremendously influential since the 1970s in trans organizing, trans thought. Has done pronouns he and his, she and hers situationally. Um, Ari is 90 years old as I speak. I visit her in Albany, about 2 hours north of where I live in New Jersey, 4 or 5 times a year. I recently bought her, I did a fundraiser and bought her a iPhone because she had a flip phone. And she's a little bit out of touch. And so I'm trying to teach her how to use the iPhone. And it's a slow, hard process. But I will be going up there um, in early April to have another session with her. She's trying. How do I advance? That was, oh, okay. Ari came out in 1974 in her 30s. Um, and almost in 1974, a cisgender female friend um, did a modeling session with her. And this photo in the first slide is this is a photo session, modeling session that she did for Ari. Ari never smoked. This was all for effect, which I really liked. Ari gave me the photo album that this was from. It's now at the in Michigan, at the University of Michigan, but it's also digitally online. Pictures at the University of Michigan and the Digital Transgender Archive. Great book. She's since given me other albums from the 70s, and the photos are just fabulous. Um, if you see, this is from the very first Fantasia Fair. Fantasia Fair was a 10-day long event that was started in 1975 by Ari in Provincetown on Cape Cod on the East Coast. It's now called Transgender Week, and we just had our 50th annual event. So we're the longest running trans event. A lot, many trans conferences, many trans scholars, or many organizations have been formed out of activity at Fantasia Fair. It's been called the mother of all transgender events with good reason. This is a page from an album Ari gave me of the very first. And if you notice the beehive hairdo, I don't think she ever rocked that beehive anywhere else. Um, there's a oil painting here at the Transgender Archive that's made from I think it's either I think it's the photograph at the bottom left, but it's Ari in profile with that hairdo and with that brown coat, and you can probably see it at the Transgender Archive later today or tomorrow. Um, this was Ari in October in Provincetown. We brought her in as a special guest. It's for the 50th anniversary. And think about that. You start something and 50 years later, you're still there. It's just wonderful. Ari was important for a number of reasons. The first, in 1975, the world was very binary. People didn't think much outside of the black and white box when it came to gender. Ari, the community was separated. Virginia Prince was a heterosexual crossdresser who deliberately kept anyone that was gay or bi or transsexual out of her groups. They were only for heterosexual men. The gender clinics were telling transsexuals, which was the term then in use, to now you're fixed. You were broken and now you're fixed. And you are now going to just get rid of all your trans friends and cast aside your past and go and have a wonderful new life because, this is what we did for you. We fixed you. You were broken. At that time, Ari was accepting anybody into at Fantasia Fair and anyone into her counseling practice, and she just did not discriminate. And she identified as an androgyne. That was about the only term that she could use at the time that might today translate as non-binary. And as bisexual. So she was really kind of everything Virginia Prince did not want in her groups. And I went to the first Fantasia Fair in 1991 when I was asked to be on the board, expecting it to be a meeting of well-to-do crossdressers, because that is how it was portrayed. in Playboy magazine in an article in 1980 by D. Keith Manna, one of the staff writers. And it wasn't. There was everybody there. There were trans men. There were people would now call themselves binary. There were cross-dressers. There were people just questioning and looking at what their story was and what their trajectory was. So Ari was pushing a boundary. I don't even know if she knew she was doing it, but she was pushing a number of boundaries in 1975. So she came out in 71. In 75, she co-founded and organized Fantasia Fair. And she showed up. She gets it all laid out. It's all going to be in, it spills to the whole town now, but it's all going to be in one hotel. And a week before, she goes to town to check. And the building, the hotel had been foreclosed. Everyone was staying there. All the meals were there. All the activities were there. And there's a padlock on the door. And Stan Sorrentino from another inn, who was a mobster who later fled the country for tax evasion, nevertheless did this community a favor by hosting the very first Fantasia Fair, but it almost didn't happen. She founded a counseling service, and she counseled thousands of trans people. And she started a nonprofit that was called the Human Outreach and Achievement Institute, and then changed to the Outreach Institute for Gender Studies. And she was very active at that. She made media appearances on radio and television and in newspapers. She did public seminars and printed the procedures. She published them. This is important, she did presentations at professional conferences for physicians, psychologists, psychiatrists, sociologists, and sexologists. And she really got sexologists who had been ignoring us interested in gender. And that has really paid off in terms of the fact that so many of us can now operate in those professions, because I guarantee you we could not before the early 90s. She published a newsletter and a very good journal. She started the New Woman Conference in the about 92, 91. I went to the second one. It was for post-operative transsexuals. And she went, this is a story, and all the women got into the hot tub, and Ari came, and Ari has male anatomy, jumped in the hot tub, so Ari was disinvited from their own conference. In later years, Ari, with David Prock, was a psychologist, did gender attitude reassessment programs, which were based upon something called the SARP that the sexology organizations were doing to look at sexual attitudes. So very busy, very influential person. This is Ari in October. When I gave Ari the iPhone and Ari was recognized. I started at Fantasia Fair in 1990 or 1991, a Lifetime Achievement Award called the Transgender Pioneer Award, to recognize people like Ari who never made any money on the community. They just gave her their time, they gave her their energy, and they gave her their love. And Ari certainly qualifies. And I have there's a tremendous amount of video and print material from Fantasia Fair. I have a huge archive of that. I'm going to be sending a bunch of stuff to Michael. I talked to Michael Radmacher about that. But if anyone's looking for a doctoral dissertation, here it is. There's a lot of documentation. You won't even have to spend much time in the archives. So thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. I'm excited to be here today. And I'll try to keep track of my own time, but if I start to run over, please feel free to interrupt. Hi, so my name is Elvis. I'm reporting live from Brooklyn, New York. I'm involved in a lot of different queer academic groups and archives and such, but most importantly for today is Reed Erickson, who I'm hoping that people may know things about, since you are all located at the University of Victoria, where there's so much great resources about his extremely unique life. So for those who don't know, or to just kind of rekindle, who is Reed Erickson? So I was really fascinated. He was born in 1917. He ended up kind of seeking out medical transition in the early 60s, possibly even in the late 50s. It's kind of unclear. He also was an extremely wealthy individual. So he amassed this massive fortune, especially after his father passed away. He made some wise investments. Suddenly, his monthly income was hundreds of thousands of dollars. And most crucially, he actually used that to support a huge amount of trans healthcare and also advocacy networks across the United States to an extent that is really not known. And that is my question. Why do we not know who is Reed Erickson more? Because he's so unique, he did so much. So we're going to kind of do a very short deep dive in this presentation. On the right, I wanted to add a couple of fun images. This is actually a newspaper photo of his own personal pet leopard called Henry. So aside from philanthropy, he was extremely in the kind of, I'm a rich, eccentric individual living a very colorful lifestyle. I do wonder if his kind of historical invisibility has to do with being transmasculine. We won't really get into that here, but it's a question that I wonder about. So just one more photo of the wonderful leopard, just to kind of give a sense of his, deep flamboyance and unusual ways. But in terms of philanthropy, so I did a fellowship at the Rockefeller Center Archives, where I learned a lot about how major foundations worked in relationship to queer causes, right? Before that, I didn't really know how was the philanthropic world really responding or not to all of the grassroots activism, right, that we know about that happened before Stonewall, after Stonewall. Reed Erickson's lifestyle period with the EEF is kind of overlapping some of that. So he was really active. He basically founded this organization to host all of his philanthropic activities called the Erickson Educational Foundation, so the EEF. It did so much that I could not possibly fit it even into 5 minutes. It's just so much. They supported many different types of projects, individual researchers, personal research, book projects, then even less academic things. He was really interested in creativity and how that related to gender identity and all these other swath of very kind of out there ideas, really stretching the limits of the imagination. On the right, we have a picture of some dolphins and someone holding a guitar. So this is one of the projects that was not directly running through the EEF, but it was a project about human-dolphin communication. I love this stuff. So this is the kind of thing that Reed was funding. However, if you're kind of reading some of this dense text, he also funded countless international conferences about gender dysphoria, gender identity, really putting this issue on the map completely. And most importantly, or most kind of crucially, he kind of started the Johns Hopkins Gender Identity Clinic. So in the late 60s, all of this huge amount of activity and wealth is being funneled into these public-facing academic entities, which is, really pushing trans people into the mainstream in a way they were not really there before. Definitely not in the 50s, but not even through the academic presence that they already did have in scholarship. Another thing that Reed did during that period of time was purchase the Milbank estate. This was in the early 80s. So he literally purchased a giant mansion that is just voluminously large in Los Angeles, intending at that time to give it to One Incorporated, which has now become the One Archives, also formerly ran the magazine One, and a lot of other different initiatives, primarily run by gay men. Then there were issues with this, and it was only resolved after his death, but it was another major initiative that kind of pushed forwards trans rights to a huge degree. So how can we kind of get into the work of the EF in terms of how it connects back to philanthropy? And that's where I'm going to focus for the rest of this talk. The way that he intersects with the time period is really unique, because in 1964, I mean, just to even think about what's happening right now in the United States, we're talking about 1964. We're just past the Cold War. We're just past the Red Scare and all this anti-communism, anti-homosexual stuff that's kind of stewing in the culture. There is nothing going on with federal philanthropy, of any federal funding or philanthropy or human rights funding. Nothing is happening. The interesting thing to me was what I learned in looking at the kind of private sector philanthropy is that it's actually still kind of limited to a couple of very large foundations that give very broadly. So the Ford Foundation is still the #1 top international funder of queer rights in the world, and they are way ahead of any other organization by far. So once the funding landscape starts to shift in the late 90s, it kind of gives us a clue to what was happening before and why queer people were being ignored, completely. So again, I'll try to keep us within the scope of kind of thinking about Reid, thinking about his work, and then philanthropy, and looking backwards. So in the 60s, the 70s, into the 80s, even into the 90s, one of the really interesting things I found was that queer people were not considered a minority group. When you referenced this concept of, marginalized groups, it was, people were talking about race, they were talking about gender. They were not talking about gay rights even into the 80s. So this is a memo from the Ford Foundation from 1974. You can see there's no mention of any other groups. There's no concept that queer people are different, or that they are not intersected, that their needs are not being met within the umbrella of, let's say, racial minority groups and women, as construed at that time. So they're basically invisible. Again, all of the funding that did start to come in at that time in the early 90s really just came from one singular entity. So previous to this, the only fundraising hitting queer communities was from queer communities and their allies as individuals, not through the private sector of philanthropy. And what you keep seeing in some of these memos or reports is that everyone's realizing, there's a lot of conflict. Can we give to queer groups at all? No one can seem to remember. They weren't tracking any of the gay grants because they didn't understand queer people as a group at all. So I thought that was just really interesting. It was kind of a strange moment, even as late as the 1990s. And Reid Erickson died in 1992, so it's a little bit past his time. But just putting in context that amount of funding that he infused the culture with wasn't even happening in 1997, because at that point, queer projects were receiving 0.1% of philanthropic dollars. And queer people were actually being funded less than the second lowest recipient of funding, which was migrant farm workers. So just to think about the visibility issues that happen today, it's really interesting of like who's really being seen and who's not being seen, and who's in the public culture and who is not. So I'll just say one thing about this is that mostly this started to shift in the late 80s, but it still was that if you had any queer issue, especially with HIV and AIDS, there were a lot of delays getting that federal funding going, and it's still really a drop in the bucket. So to go back, all of that to me really makes Reid Erickson's work as an individual funder and through a foundation extremely unique. So in 1966, although they can only see 2 patients a month, which, as we can imagine, for trans healthcare is like very, very small, this is what's happening primarily because Reid is kind of pushing the cultural boundary and saying, hey, I'm going to fund trans healthcare like crazy. And so suddenly there's news articles appearing about this, new sex change clinic that no one's ever heard of before, because none of this really existed. So he's sort of putting into place something that's very public that was not in the public culture. A huge amount of news stories have an underlying connection to the EEF that is not clearly visible at first glance. So this is an article called "The Clergy Doesn't Object to Sex Change" from 1966. Not clear exactly where they're going with that article, but we can connect that back to the EEF because they were doing so much on the ground work, advocacy work that was really hitting a different pool of people than grassroots queer activism was even trying to get to. So the EEF would actually send these pamphlets that they would create out to police departments. They would send them to, religious entities, churches. They would try to invite clergy to their conferences about trans rights. This is a really interesting thing. I think the EEF is sometimes positioned as being very focused on professionalizing and kind of using these networks that are kind of normal, essentially normie pathways like the police that are typically not very friendly to queer people. But in the same way, he's hitting this whole network of entities that are actually very influential. So it's a really interesting kind of balance of what he's doing. The second thing that I wanted to say is, why don't we know about him? Some of the reasons were himself, and his own intentions, and I think his own transness and wanting to kind of step back. So when you read about the EF in these news articles, I think he's pretty much never, that I've seen, mentioned by name. It's always a wealthy industrialist, perhaps, who lives in Mexico. That's the closest you get. It's very oblique, and there's kind of this shroud of the EF, but really it's Reed Erickson and literally two other people who are staffing the EF, even though it claims to have multiple offices. Those are really Reed's homes in Mexico and in Louisiana and California. It's very small, but his wealth is so vast that he's kind of projecting this larger than life image across the United States. Again, I wanted to end on the note of, anytime you're talking about philanthropy, you kind of wonder, is this a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Especially right now, I think this question is very salient, given what's happening in the public culture in the United States with billionaires and their presence. But I have to say, with Reed Erickson, the public good is so profound. It's hard to not get on board with what he did and what he was able to achieve in really only a window of about 13 years that the EEF itself as an entity was active. Negative impacts are possibly many. He funded a lot of odd individuals, including John C. Lilly, the person who is giving dolphins LSD. Is that a great idea? I'm going to just leave it there. A lot of other controversial figures, but I think the people who were willing to kind of get into, trans healthcare also had a lot of independence based on their position, and that can be pulled apart a little bit more. The last point I'll say is that he did become very heavily addicted to drugs at the end of his life. So that's another reason that Reed is a complicated figure. He was very fickle in terms of his relationship with one. He literally bought them an entire mansion that I think was valued at $9 million. And then later in that same year said, haha, not your mansion, that's my mansion. And then ensues this over 10 years legal battle that really doesn't actually ever end until Reed has passed away. So complicated. But that's kind of where we're going to leave it. Here's one photo of Reed flanked by his friends and actually his future wife, Daisy, in, I think this is 1962. So kind of the early Reed Erickson. And then very lastly, I know that there's a lot of folks in this conference who possibly knew Reed Erickson or his as director of the EEF, Zelda Sapli. So I would love to connect further. And if anyone would like to talk or connect, please feel free to reach out. And thank you for your time.